I'm Cloverley Lawrence. I'm from SANParks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's occurring in the marine environment and in a marine context, and some of the challenges that's being faced, that SANParks faces at the moment, particularly around the case of the African penguin. Now, for the benefit of my colleague here who hasn't seen one, the African penguin is South Africa's and Namibia's endemic penguin species. So it only occurs in South Africa and Namibia. It's been on a decline quite substantially over the last, well, decades, should I say. It's been listed as endangered since 2010. SANParks manages the most, or should I say the largest remaining colonies in boulders, in Table Mountain, in some aspects of the West Coast National Park, some islands should I say, and in Algoa Bay, in some of the islands there. But its trajectory continues as declining, to the point where it's scarily going to become functionally extinct in the next 15 years if we don't do anything. There's a multitude of reasons why it's gotten to be where it is. It has had historical declines. It was heavily harvested for its well, as a food, but all as in people eating penguins, but also their eggs. And then later on, their guano was harvested as fertilizer for over 200 years. And that caused a massive decline through the 20th century. From millions to 17,000 breeding pairs by 2019, a 99% decline. So just to give you a context, that's an island in 1930 where you had something like 5 million penguins. And in 2009, we're looking at a 90% decline. So guano harvesting, and guano was quite important for their nest building. They burrow in guano, and it provides one of the most ideal environments for them for protection, but also temperature regulation. More recently, the recent declines has been due to a whole bunch of other threats. And the population as of 2019 was estimated at 13,000 breeding pairs, representing a 42% decline since 2010. And currently, as of 2022, we're looking at less than 10,000 breeding pairs. So it is not doing well. And the projection, like I said, is heading towards functional extinction if we don't do anything. Now, the host of threats currently, there's quite a few, and it's the compounding effect of these multiple threats. There's predation, especially given the compromise in their breeding structures, their preferred breeding habitat. The severe environmental conditions, they've been subjected to oil spills and oiling. More recently, noise pollution is quite a big impact, as well as disturbance, like physical disturbance and displacement from shipping activities. Also, disease has been quite problematic. And then food scarcity, and that's come out as a very, very strong driver in the overall declines of their populations. They are very selective in the prey that they eat. They prefer sardine and anchovy, and we've had massive shifts in the distribution of these fish stocks, but also declines in their abundance in general. Probably and very likely due to overfishing has been the case in Namibia, where they've pretty much decimated their sardine and anchovy stocks, and which has not recovered. And South Africa is heading down a similar trajectory, and the fishery seems to have shifted from the west coast more to the south and east coast. And that's also because these are quite migratory species. And the reliance on this prey, you can imagine, is quite important for the whole trophic structure in the marine environment, and not just penguins. There are 3 threatened birds, endangered bird species at the moment, seabird species, penguin being one of them. The Cape cormorant is also not doing very well, as well as Cape gannets. And there's lots of scientific evidence to show that the strong reliance on the food and the distribution of their prey has constituted a lot to the declines of these species. So that prey aspect is quite critical in terms of how we're trying to manage the species, or understand at least the drivers of their decline. And if you understand the importance of the prey, or should I say food scarcity, like I mentioned, there's been a shift in the distribution. Fishing has become quite a significant impact. We need healthy chicks to grow into healthy adults. We need healthy adults that are then able to reproduce and produce healthy chicks, and nutrition, I guess, 101. So between 2004 and 2012, starvation was stated as the key cause of about 60% of adult and 92% of juvenile deaths from carcasses. And the life cycle of the penguin is very, very dependent on food sources. So they need to fatten up to be able to feed or support their chicks and rear their chicks. They need to be able to fish or collect food in a close enough food location to where their nests are, to be able to travel back to be able to feed their chicks, as well as the important or critical period where they molt. So they go through this catastrophic molt once a year. They shed all their feathers, and they basically starve during that period for about 3 weeks. They cannot feed, they cannot basically swim. And before that stage, they really need adequate food resources, adequate fat stores. And if they don't have that, then it's an unsuccessful molt, which then leads to death, or it perhaps leads to just a failed recruitment in the case of the parents. So this was brought to the government. This was made known. Lots of scientific research went into this to identify these critical periods and the shortage of food and the importance of the food. But then, of course, this was contested by the fisheries departments and perhaps the fishery scientists themselves, who were quite confident in their models and in their ways in which they were handling that resource. And they were convinced that there was adequate food supply for them, for the fishery, as well as for the penguins. But in order to provide the scientific basis on what was being called for, and that was for fishing to be excluded around the penguin foraging colonies, or foraging area around the colonies, they embarked on an experiment to decide whether fishing was really the issue. And the island closure experiment started in 2008, and this was to, like I say, provide the scientific evidence for the impact of sufficient prey for penguins as a result of competition with the purse seine fishing. 4 islands were chosen, or should I say island pairs, 2 on the west coast, Dustin and Robin, and 2 in Algoa Bay, which was the St. Croix and Bird Island colonies. Fishing was excluded around a 20-kilometer radius around each island, which alternated on a 3-year open and closed period. So they alternated between the two. And during that time, the parameter, the indicator that they wanted to measure to show whether it was an effect or not was, did chicks survive? What was their body condition? What was their growth rate? So that was measured during the course of that time. Well, it was found and it was published to show that, yes, there was definitely a decrease in the energy that was expended by the parents, by the breeding parents, the duration in which they forage, the distance in which they forage. Yes, there was evidence that this closure was making an impact. And it was shown in some colonies that there was a 1% increase in chick survival. So yes, that increased breeding success and it increased chick condition. And the seabird scientists were able to show that and publish it. However, it was contested by the fishery scientists, members of the national the fisheries department, and reviewed through a small pelagic fisheries working group, including the pelagic fishing industry, and they have their own contracted scientists and experts. And they raise several flaws in the experimental design, in the statistical analysis process, in the findings, basically in every possible outcome that came from this, and continue to contest that there was actually a benefit to the closures. So that rate of 1% increase in chick survival was a slowdown of the decline of 10 to 20%. But the model, the 1% doesn't really consider compounding effects of cumulative effects, should I say, of increases in other parameters. And more detailed single species models were required around that. But there was enough evidence to show, hey, this is the way to go, it does work. We've had, in the last 5 years, almost an 80% decline in Algoa Bay in the penguin population there, in what was the largest colony of penguins in the country. And that raised alarms for SANParks, and SANParks took a request to the minister and recommended long-term closures, particularly around those colonies. We asked for long-term, so like a 10-year period, year-round, so not an alternating period, around these 4 remaining colonies. Given the fact that we are losing things at an alarming rate. We were convinced the research strongly indicated that closure will benefit penguin recovery in combination with a suite of other conservation actions. And perhaps I didn't mention that there has been a suite of other things that many institutions and departments very collaboratively come together to implement, from improving nest structures to rescuing every abandoned chick or egg, rehabilitating them and releasing them back into the colony, to handling and rehabilitating almost every injured bird, every injured penguin that is still alive. So there was an understanding that fishing was not single-handedly going to be the solution, but it was an incredibly important intervention that hadn't up to this point been done very well. But of course there would have to be a compromise between, which was the arguments from the fishery side, of the potential economic impacts, that people were going to lose their jobs, that there was going to be a knock-on effect and a lack of revenue. We were compromising livelihoods, and that needed to be balanced. So those strong arguments were coming from the fishery side. Our minister, which was quite an important role player, quite key in her position, because she supported the closures and she was quite concerned about the penguins. But she had this conflicting science. She had the 2 bodies of scientists saying very conflicting things to her, and she was caught in the middle, having to balance the fisheries concerns and the concerns around the economic losses, but faced with the importance of needing to do what we needed to do for the penguins. She put together a team. She asked for all the science to be synthesized, to basically try to untangle where the discrepancies were, and to reach an understanding, to reach a compromise. And that was just over a year-long process. Lots of engagements with different stakeholders. We produced a synthesis report of the scientific information with engagement with the scientific community, but also the fisheries community and other key stakeholders at large. There's been local and international expert reviews of that. But up to this point, or up to this year, no real major decision has been made, and the penguins continue to suffer, and it's been quite concerning. And we understand she is in a critical position, having to balance these different conflicting information, but at the same time, the necessity to act, but also to implement the precautionary approach it weighs really heavily, and I think needs to be considered there. So there was strong research, like I said. So this dialogue has been taken to the media. I don't know if many of you have seen this, but seen the articles that have come out over the years, but definitely in the last 2 years, some criticizing the processes and the fact that no action has been taken. Then, of course, the fishery scientists saying we have to follow the science. We can't be emotional on this. It requires, look at the data, look at the science. We have to base our decisions on science. So the science is flawed, and therefore, it's perhaps we cannot act as a result. So that's kind of been the dialogue follow through in the media. It's very emotional at the same time. And you'll note it really follows penguins. Nobody mentions gannets or Cape cormorants, which are also quite important and needing action. So just to highlight some of the challenges of working in the marine space, and I think the African penguin really brings this home, is SANParks is mandated, and we have our objectives around providing, protection and meeting our biodiversity objectives and goals. But we are trying to manage species that move out of our protected spaces, of the spaces that we can manage. So it's not about managing them. We actually cannot manage them. We can only manage people. We can manage the actions and activities of the multiple users. And when I say manage, I mean that's not straightforward either. It's around engagement, it's around compromise, and it's around dialogue, managing conflicting economic drivers for expansion, but also trying to balance that with conservation and protection goals. Especially in Algoa Bay, where you have a protected area right on the boundary of a port, 2 ports actually, with a lot of pressure to develop and bring in economic growth, especially in an impoverished area. And the impacts of those activities are compounding, and they spread. They're not isolated, just confined to the port. So management in the marine space requires constant engagement and constant input from stakeholders, understanding multiple levels of governance, and engaging on those fronts. A key tool that can be implemented is the marine spatial planning tools that the government or South Africa has embarked on, but these are not without their own challenges. Needing, should I say, transformative change in many of their processes.